Greetings. Let me welcome everybody to Patrick Henry College's Newsmaker interview series. As you know, our series is hosted by Dr. Marvin Olasky. We're delighted to have Dr. Olasky here. Of course, he's editor-in-chief of World Magazine, but maybe more especially for us, Dr. Olasky holds our distinguished chair in journalism and public policy, and we're delighted to have him on our faculty. He's bringing to us a series of important leaders in public affairs or in Christian ministry in one line or another, and so we're delighted to have a new guest today. Let me also give you a little detail about that guest. Jim Liske, welcome to Patrick Henry College. I understand that you served as senior pastor of Ridgepoint Community Church in Michigan for 9 years before you've taken over the chief executive officer responsibilities from Prison Fellowship's founder, Chuck Colson, in July of last summer, if I've got that right. During his 9 years at Ridgepoint, Reverend Liske had been committed to prison ministry, and under his leadership, the church began what became known as 70x7 Life Recovery, an organization that helps newly released prisoners transition back to the community. He has likewise led churches and ministry efforts in the U.S., Canada, Africa, Belize, Romania, the Dominican Republic, and Honduras, using his entrepreneurial skills to bring together churches, business, law enforcement agencies, and parole officers for the common good in each location. Liske has long shared Prison Fellowship's passion to show Christ's compassion to those in the criminal justice system. He grew up on a family farm in Michigan where he says he gained a strong work ethic and a firm Christian foundation. He sensed a call to full-time ministry as a young man, and in 1986 earned a master's degree from Denver Seminary in Colorado. Please give a warm welcome to both Marvin Olasky and Jim Liske.
Well, let's start out with a news note that's both sad for us, but will very soon be glorious for the individual involved.
Yes, yeah, we received news yesterday morning that, Chuck Colson's health had taken a turn for the worse. As you know, a few weeks ago he had surgery to remove a large pool of clotted blood on his brain. He had become ill while teaching at the Wilberforce weekend, and he was improving, showing steady improvement each day, and yesterday they believe that a blood clot actually moved to one of his lungs, and his respiratory difficulties have caused the doctors to say it will probably be hours and not days before Chuck will meet the Jesus he loves and the Jesus he has served. And we obviously have an extremely heavy heart, but we also know that if Chuck were here speaking to us, one of his quotes was, "Stand your post and do your duty." And that he has handed us a legacy of serving the least and the lost and the forgotten, and also serving the issue of a Christian worldview, and how having that moves us to serve the least and the lost and the forgotten. So we would continue to ask for your prayers for Patty and for the family. The family is all here. They've been able to gather for these last moments, and certainly continue to pray for Chuck and ask the Lord to accept him into his glory graciously and calmly with great comfort. And praise the Lord with him that he will soon hear, I believe, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."
And some prisoners at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola have been busy.
They have, yes. We called them last night to ask them if they would make the coffin that Chuck will be interred in. And they started last night, and actually the warden allowed them to work through the night so they can have it prepared, and they will make, at Chuck's request, a pine box to be fashioned for Chuck to be buried in. So that's be a special, very special for the family when they heard that today, and certainly the great symbolism of, you know, Chuck literally being embraced by those that he served so faithfully over the last 35 years.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Michigan. Go blue.
Go blue, yes. Yeah, you share some of those amazing blue roots.
Right.
And, you know, I'm a farm boy from northern Michigan. I had the privilege of being raised by a mom and a dad, and in a family that loved the Lord, served the Lord, always involved in the church, you know, raised in a wonderful Baptist church that was not too legalistic, was built on grace, and really raised in an environment that allowed me to flourish in my faith. Had room for me to do what I believe we need to do at times, and rebelling and finding our own parameters, owning our own faith, but certainly always with strong guidance as to what the truth was, and will continue to be. And I bless God for that, and felt a call into the ministry very early on. And,
how early?
You know, I was 16 when I felt the call in the ministry. My mother reminds me of a time when I was younger that I told our pastor when I was a child that I wanted to be a pastor because I'd only have to work on Sunday. And there were times in my career she had to remind me that I'd said that. So when I was 16, I was in high school. And again, a privilege to be involved in a church and a family that encouraged the development of leadership and placed young leaders in positions where we actually had appropriate authority. And blessed to have a childhood pastor, which any of you going into the ministry, I would encourage you to do this, that, you know, looked at me and said, you need to consider going into the ministry, and challenged me to hear what the Lord was saying to me. Yeah.
So you had an external call from those individuals. How did the internal call come?
I was, no one will know this name except those of us that are old enough, and don't smile because you'll date yourself, because Dawson McAllister, I heard Dawson McAllister speak. He was a youth speaker, and you know, he challenged a public commitment. If you're feeling a call into the ministry, and it's just one of those Holy Spirit moments where you sense, hear, however you want to term it, that the Lord is saying, this is you. This is your commitment. You need to make this. And at 16, made a public commitment and said, you know what, I'm going to serve the Lord in some capacity full time. So external, internal, and then later on in ministry, the Macedonian call of a church saying, come here and help us. We need your leadership. And those three things combining, really causing me to understand, yeah, this is where the Lord has me going.
And that was in Michigan, but you also spent 13 years in Calgary?
Yes, yeah, we pastored first in Michigan. My wife and I got married before we went to seminary, and she graciously supported me through that endeavor. And we pastored for 3.5 years on staff as an associate in Michigan, and then for 8 years in Ottawa, Ontario, and 13 years in Calgary, Alberta, before coming back to Michigan.
And then how did your call to prison fellowship come?
Yeah, you know, that has a personal element to it, because I had a family member who went to prison 7 years ago. And, you know, white, in this particular case, middle class, upper middle class, go to church every week, be in youth group. Families don't have people go to prison, right? That's not who goes to those places. And that was kind of a personal moment where I understood, in listening to my own family, work through that. And when you're a pastor in a family, you're still a pastor. You still get the phone calls, what do we do? But you know, wrestling with giving counsel, but with my own sense of, number one, I didn't know how to deal with that personally, and number two, I had never led a church in dealing with that properly. And so it was really a sense of the church is missing the boat here with this population. I started sharing that as I was teaching, kind of my own personal wrestling match. You know, this isn't the way this is supposed to happen. We started journeying as a church together. One weekend, I just, in leading the Spirit, said, you know, I want everyone who has a child or a nephew or a grandchild who's incarcerated, will you raise your hand? And I was shocked. 25% of my faith community raised their hand over 4 services. Wow. And myself and the elders gathered later that week, and we were like, wow. We're supposed to be shepherding this group, and we had no idea. And then the next week I said, you know, we're going to do this again. If you have someone who's incarcerated in your family, raise your hand. If you've been affected by a crime, you raise your hand. And that's 75% of our faith community. We're just kind of a pretty normal, average, middle America congregation, mostly white, mostly middle class. Then we had someone actually come back to the church who was re-entering culture. And he came and he needed a job. He had been a supervising RN at a hospital before he broke the law. And he broke the law. He needed to go to prison. He needed to accept the incarceration that culture and the law says is appropriate. But when he came back, the barriers of gaining his life again, I was astounded. I had no idea. He came into my office one day after cleaning toilets. We had 166 toilets in our building, so we could keep him busy doing that. But he came in and he said, I know why I'm here. And he had been hearing the Lord speak to him over the last few weeks, and he outlined this re-entry program. And of course our board and our elders had to wrestle with the fact that we'd hired an ex-offender. So we were working through some of the business issues, the legal issues. We have children in our building and all of those things. But the Lord really laid this on Doug. And we had him benchmark some organizations, and we birthed a not-for-profit, and then we understood we needed another not-for-profit in addiction recovery, because that's an issue of 90% of ex-felons. Then we needed to birth a not-for-profit in job placement, because we needed employment things. And then we, while we were at it, we created a fourth one in construction that we could help ex-offenders find jobs. And we spent 6 years then closely working with the state of Michigan, which was a real joy and a gift, that the governor and her office, parole, probation, really worked with us in changing laws, changing policies, changing the way corrections put inmates in certain prisons, where, how close to family, at what time during their incarceration, where were they incarcerated just before their release. We were able to work through that. That was called the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. All this time I'm getting an unbelievable education. They hadn't taught me any of this in seminary. And we were able to be part of bringing recidivism down to 3% in 3 counties.
3%?
3%.
That's phenomenal.
The average in the state of Michigan at that time, which Michigan is leading in recidivism rates right now, and they're at 38%. They were at 50% before we started the MPRI program, because we really tried to encourage churches all over the state. This is an issue. And we became really a place, by God's grace, that churches, pastors could come to and say, how did you do this? And we'd be very open with them. It was hard. We lost some people. We had people leave. And I'm sympathetic to that. It's a difficult issue. Chuck came about 3 years ago to see what we were doing, and I'd known him for a couple of years already. And he was just, it was a very gratifying moment, because there were about 100 inmates at an event. We would have a family meal every Tuesday at lunch, where the church staff, church people, all the men and women in the program, parole, we'd have law enforcement, judges, would all come together, and we'd eat together in a very New Testament manner and break bread together. Chuck came one day when we were doing that, and the inmates all made this long line, and one by one shook his hand and thanked him for prison fellowship. When the position of prison fellowship came open, Chuck came and visited. I told him no 3 times, and then I had to submit to the Lord. And it was John chapter 21, and it was the Monday after Easter a year ago. And when the Lord is calling you and working on your heart, certain scripture that you've read over and over again but haven't paid attention to takes on a different light. And it was the first question Jesus asked Peter. Peter, do you love me more than these? And I was studying at home in my office, and I called my wife in, and I said, I need to confess idolatry. I love the church, this church, Ridgepoint Community Church, and I love these people right now more than I love Jesus. And I need to put that aside, because I think God's calling us to something. I'd never imagined I'd be in this position. I thought I'd die in the pastorate and they'd bury me on the property somewhere. But that was a definite moment where God used that passage of Scripture to convict me that, Jim, you are to love the church, you are to love my people, but you are to love Jesus the most.
Yeah. Let me ask, the people who left your church, was it because of disagreement about some of the policies you're advocating, or was it because they didn't want to sit next to a prisoner possibly in the pew?
Just the radical discomfort, because we don't talk about it, we don't educate people. They have a CSI, law and order image of an ex-felon. And the thought of being with that kind of person, they couldn't go there. It was very few, but there were definitely some. We had to work really hard to ensure that families knew their kids were safe. That was a big issue. We even went to thumbprints to get your children out of children's ministry. We did renovations to make that happen, because we do need to keep our kids safe, and there are some realities that you have to face, and at the same time, you have to help the ex-offender not be tempted, right? We have a leadership responsibility to them. Ridgepoint's a pretty unusual church. They embraced it pretty quickly, but we did work with other churches, helping them walk through the steps, because the last thing we want is for an ex-offender who really wants to come back and be integrated into the church community, the last thing we want is for them to have an initial bad experience.
Yeah. And were there some initial bad experiences as you were getting into this?
Yeah, we had some failures. We learned some things the hard way. We also had individuals that, the table was perfectly set for them to succeed, and they chose to reoffend. Whenever you're dealing with leading people, you're going to have situations that aren't going to come out as if you were creating widgets. But by and large, once we learned the process and once we learned from other groups, the success, frankly, was to me a bit miraculous.
What was the best policy change of the state of Michigan to help prisoners and help folks in your church be able to do a better job with them?
Incarcerating inmates as close as possible to their community they're returning to in the last 12 to 18 months of incarceration. Okay. Putting them in a situation where, I'm going to give you two. There's another one that's closely related to that. And that is the policy of allowing a mentor to begin a relationship with an inmate and then continue it outside the walls. Okay. In most states, that's not the case. So by putting the inmate as close to the community they were going to return to, and
let me just ask, would this be the community that they had come from? Or
not necessarily. Okay. Yep. The old policies, most often found in states, is they return to the community they last broke the law in.
Right.
That's where the paperwork is. And that's really the reason, it is an administrative function. But I understand that. It's expensive to move things. But when you incarcerate that inmate at the place that they're going to return to, where their support system is, you allow someone from the community to come in and start building a relationship with them so that when they leave the controlled environment, and that's what I think we fail to understand. Even an inmate who's been incarcerated for a couple of years, even 18 months, they've been told when to get up, when to eat, when to go to the bathroom, when to recreate. Their decision-making muscles, if you would, atrophy. And when they come outside the walls, it is this plethora of decisions that need to be made. If they don't have a mentor who is able to walk with them down that path, help them sift through the information, their chance of success is very low, because they will default back to previous behavior.
Right.
And when you incarcerate them close to where they're going, you allow that relationship to be built, you give them the best chance. Now take someone, we had individuals who came out that have been incarcerated for 20 years. Now think of the technology that wasn't around 20 years ago. And the individual, the true story, that went to the job placement location, and that afternoon he went to a Walgreens, took something off the shelf, walked through the metal detector, stood outside the door, turned around and waited for the security guard to come and get him. And when law enforcement called the mentor and we engaged, why'd you do that? They put me in front of a TV and told me to register for a job. It was a computer screen. He'd never seen a computer screen. And so when we enter into their world and start understanding, if they come back alone, we probably shouldn't be surprised if they recidivate.
We have about, what, 2.3 million Americans in prison now?
That's only in prisons. That does not include jails, right? And, we have 25,000 on Rikers Island alone.
Right.
And, and that's not the largest. LA County is the largest.
So is that number too high?
It is, because the states are solving their budget problems right now, one way they are, by leaving convicted felons in county jails longer. It used to be a stay of 8 months in a county jail was long. Now it's a year. Now some states are pushing it beyond a year. And LA County has approximately 30,000 inmates in LA County, and they have some inmates that are there on a 2-year sentence. But then you look at the inmates who are coming back year after year for an 8-month sentence. So you have some long-term people being incarcerated in county jails also. But 2.3 is the safe number. We can count them in the state and federal prison system.
So what should we do to try to reduce that number while still maintaining some degree of public safety?
And let me emphasize that. We believe that public safety is paramount. Mm-hmm. Isaiah 32:18 says that God's desire is that we live in safe communities and tranquil dwellings. We have some pretty clear instructions from our Lord as to what that should look like. Ephesians, Paul says people need to stop stealing, get a job, so they too have something to share. So we understand the picture of the kingdom. I think we need to look at what the desired end result is. I'm not sure in most situations in incarceration right now we're doing that. We're looking at a medium result. Person broke the law. How do we then isolate them from the community in such a way that the communities are safer? What we're forgetting is 90% of that 2.3 million will come home. They will be released. We release 600,000 inmates a year from state and federal prisons. That's the size of Montana. Every year Montana comes home. The question is, what kind of neighbors will they be? That's really the operative question in corrections we need to start asking. What type of a person are we welcoming back to our neighborhood? What kind of reform are they actually getting inside the walls? Are they learning soft skills? Are they learning how to resolve conflict well? In that last 12 to 18 months of incarceration, that pre-release, are they learning parenting skills? Are they learning what it means to come back and be a son? Are they learning some of the practical things that you and I, really, Marvin, take for granted? We had a young man, came home, got in the program. He'd been incarcerated his first time at 12. He was stealing in the city of Chicago to feed his sister because he didn't know his mom, and he didn't know his dad, and his mom was a meth addict. So he was literally stealing to survive. He got out of prison then, state of Michigan prison, when he was 28. Got into our program, did not want to go back to jail, just started eating everything alive. He'd come to Christ in prison. He was a delight to watch grow. We thought, here's one of our poster guys. This is great. Got a job. His first week, he was there early. He left late. The individual that hired him said, man, if these are the kind of guys I can hire in this program, I want more. The next Monday morning, he didn't come to work. And we're like, oh, my goodness. And we go. I actually went with the mentor, and here was this young man. He was sitting on his front porch drinking a cup of coffee. Why aren't you at work? He said, well, Mr. Bob. Bob was his mentor's name. I got paid Friday. I have food in the fridge. I paid my rent. Well, when do you steal? You steal when you need something. We'd never taught this young man he had to go back to work on Monday, and no one had ever taught him to go back to work on Monday. Being raised on a farm, I had to be taught not to work on Sunday, right? But we completely took for granted that this young man knew how to come home and be a good neighbor, and he didn't.
Let me ask concerning Patrick Henry College students. What should they know if some of them feel a calling to work with prisoners, to help in some way? What types of things can they be learning? Should they be learning now? What types of things should they be thinking about?
I think there's a movement among our 20-somethings, and we see it with our volunteers, and I hear about it on college campuses. First, I would applaud the 20-somethings. You're a movement generation, and you're an action generation. Continue to be that way as you grow old. Continue to be, part of I think, an emerging nature in our church that's saying, hey, let's go do the gospel. Let's be involved in it. There are little things you can do, like call your local parole officer and really shock them and say, is there something I can help you with? He's going to give you one of two answers. He's going to ask you if you'd be willing to provide transportation for someone that needs to go to a job interview, but most likely he's going to ask you if you have an extra bike. Individuals come home without driver's license, right? That's one of the major barriers is transportation. I cannot tell you how many bicycles that I've been part of giving to parole officers so that when someone comes home, they have a way to get to where they need to go. I would encourage you to get proper training because remember, these individuals, particularly if they have a long history of crime, are incredible liars. They've survived by conning people. And to get the training, we have training on our website that you can get and individuals you can walk alongside of. If you know someone that's been going into jail or into prison doing ministry for a while, just ask, hey, can I go with you? Can I learn what you know? Because again, we need to set individuals up for success. If we're entering into their world of conning and we're not living out and drawing the proper parameters that we see in the gospel, we're not helping them. And understanding, this individual didn't go to work Monday. We took him back to work, and of course the employer wanted to just let him go back to work, and I said, no, you can't. He needs to be disciplined as you would discipline any other employee, so he lost a day's pay. that was incredibly appropriate for that young man to understand. This is what's proper. This is what's biblical. When I put in a good day's work, I get a good day's wage. And so it's not appropriate for us to become enablers when an ex-offender comes home. There is a ton of work to be done in the juvenile area. And it's something that Prison Fellowship is looking at hard and long. We look at it with the Colson Center of how are we helping parents raise their kids up with a proper biblical worldview to avoid some of these things. Justice Fellowship is inundated by requests from states. Help us understand what to do with the juvenile situation. And so if there's a way your church can get involved in even mentoring at-risk kids, we know that a child from a single-parent family has a higher incarceration rate. We know that a child with an incarcerated parent is at least 5 out of 10 of those kids will be incarcerated if they have an incarcerated parent. Some statistics say it's 7 out of 10. But we know at least half of them. Can you get involved in being a mentor to a young child at a local public school? But who are the at-risk kids that you can come alongside of and say, hey, can I show you how I've learned to live? Can I show you who I've learned to follow? I think you'd be amazed at the number of those, particularly middle schoolers, that would just love having attention like that. It's the preventative things in breaking the cycle that are just as important as how we're going to deal with people coming home.
Right, so that's where we should be putting the emphasis, as you are, on what individuals can do as individuals to help other people. Let's talk a little bit about individual Christians as citizens. Let's go through some policy issues. One thing that's very much in being debated now is the whole question of drug decriminalization. Should a person who is caught with an ounce of marijuana go to prison?
Again, I think the law has to look at the intent of the possession of that ounce of marijuana. If the intent is to sell, okay, then we have behavior that is tremendously, I believe, dangerous for a community. Because obviously the more intoxicated people or addicted people we have in our communities, the less safe they are. But I think we need to take a hard look at the number of individuals we have that we're incarcerating who are addicts. On their first offense, if we incarcerate them without treatment for the addiction, we will release dry addicts. We will not solve the problem. And we will spend, if we incarcerate them in state facilities, on the average $35,000 to $40,000 a year for their room and board. There are some wonderful programs out. We have the HOPE program in Hawaii that's been developed down there that is showing for every dollar spent with the HOPE program that's dealing just with addicts, very similar to I just forgot, adult drug court, sorry. Okay. Adult drug court's very similar to HOPE. And what they do is they implement quick and clear consequences to a positive drug test. So you're convicted of that 1 ounce. It's determined you're a user and not a seller. You now are subject to regular and unscheduled drug testing. If you test positive, you go to jail. Every time you go back to jail, the time increases. It helps the addict understand this is not a lifestyle culture is going to tolerate. At the same time, money is put into care for the addict and recovery for the addict, into a multitude of programs. In Hawaii, the program Christians in Recovery is offered. So they even have a faith-based process they can go to. If we're able to help them deal with their addiction, stop using, stop buying, we then start cutting off this supply chain effect to the sale of drugs. Just putting them in prison, paying a high amount of money to keep them away from society but not treating the addiction is not getting us to a safe neighbor when they come home. And you know, it's interesting how God works. Because of the price of incarceration, these other programs are being promoted, because for every dollar spent in the HOPE program or in adult drug court, you save $3 in the price of incarceration. So there's a positive payoff even from the spreadsheet. But just incarcerating them, I think it's shown we're not winning that battle. We're losing that battle. The way we've been doing it is not working.
Conservatives a generation ago were advocating mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes you're out policies. How have those worked out?
Obviously they haven't. Recidivism rate continues to climb. We do see a decline in violent crime, but not a large one. We see an increase in drug crimes, addiction crimes, white-collar crimes that are tied to drugs. That issue is not going away. Mandatory minimums have not changed that for us, and particularly three-strike laws. We have individuals that I've met in prisons that are now serving life sentences for 3 possession convictions, not sale, possession. And now we've incarcerated them at a very high cost instead of using other forms, electronic monitoring, forms of parole in the communities, really having them gain access to programs that gives them the ability to change their lifestyle. But I think a lot of the key, Marvin, is the local church. You know, when that individual is going through addiction recovery, they have to have a caring community. And God created us beautifully in the local church to provide that. It's what we do best. You know, some call it mentoring. I believe Jesus called it discipleship. And we have this intuitive understanding through the triune God who existed in community, exists in community, the Holy Spirit in us, Jesus our Savior, God our ultimate leader and guide. We as a church know how to do community. And that's exactly what these individuals need after they break the law. They need to know there is a grace-filled, yet truth-believing and living organization group that will say, come on, we will walk with you. We'll hold you accountable. We will help you get what you need. They won't get that by being incarcerated. And no, I don't believe the policies that we bought really as something that would change us 20 years ago and 10 years ago are really going to show us the change in the future.
So say there's a nonviolent offender. It's a minor possession question. Instead of sending him to prison, then what would you do?
I'm an advocate of adult drug court.
Okay.
And not every state has that. It's a wonderful organization that actually comes in and helps train states how to do it. It trains the legislators. It trains, you know, on what policies are needed. They're a wonderful organization, and they've connected very well with us. Judge Simmons from North Carolina has been one of the founders and developers of that. Fine, solid, Jesus-following man. And I've watched it work with people that we've worked with. Those who are deciding not to change their lifestyle will serve time in jail, because when the test comes back positive, it's a non-negotiable, immediate incarceration. So we end up with the same kind of end result with those who maybe will never get serious about recovering from their addiction, who may drive drunk, may drive while high. Yes, those individuals, we need to protect society from them. But we can't lump all of those who simply need a chance to recover in with this other group and throw them all into a situation where recovery is not possible. Adult Drug Court, the HOPE program, other programs like it help us separate those out. We now have a Veterans Drug Court that's been developed out of this by a judge in Baltimore. And seeing our veterans, particularly coming back from Iran and Iraq, the increased drug and alcohol use they're coming home with, he's worked with Adult Drug Court to create specific treatment programs for our veterans coming home, and is working with the Veterans Administration. Again, an alternative to simple incarceration that's been very effective in its short term.
Which states are doing the best job with relatively minor offenders, and which the worst job?
Probably right now, one of the states that's doing the best job is Minnesota.
Okay.
Also, New York is doing a good job. And forgive me, I don't mean this to sound like I'm an expert in this, but New York incarcerates the people that should be incarcerated. Minnesota does. California is being forced there right now.
By financial
right?
pressures?
Exactly. Well, in the Supreme Court ruling that as of January 1st of this year, they had to release 31,000 inmates because of overcrowding that was leaving inmates open to rape, to violence. It really was an inhumane situation in a lot of their facilities. So they've been forced to get very serious about how do we keep communities safe without overpopulating our prisons, and some of their policies right now are doing quite well. They've actually opened the door for Prison Fellowship to put 26 seminaries in 26 prisons in California, where inmates will be able to gain an entire seminary education, except for the Greek and Hebrew, We have some colleges that are looking at crediting that so that prisoners will become pastors, and when they come out, we're cooperating with World Impact, an organization in California that is helping hook those inmates to local churches to get them mentored, and World Impact will then plant churches in the urban core with those inmates. And because of the pressure put on California by the budget and by the courts, they opened the doors wide open for us. It actually gave us a special classification. They won't move the inmates once they start the program. In California, it'll be 4 years long. We worked with California to put reentry and pre-release material in it. And again, God has kind of opened a door because of these pressures. How do we better do this? How do we better do it within the amount of money we have to actually allow us to grow the Church of Jesus Christ in California in an immense way? Some of those inmates will graduate and stay in prison and become, if you would, the elders of the prison, of the church inside the walls, which for us is a key. The issue then of reentry, being able to continue to have policies, which frankly in most states we have really good access to prisons as prison fellowship. And it's a continual prayer for us that those policies remain, because building the church inside the walls so that the discipleship begins inside the walls. So these inmates aren't just returning to their community. They're leaving prison commissioned missionaries to come back. And instead of selling drugs on that corner, sharing the gospel on that corner, we start feeding that into the cycle. We will reduce the recidivism rate, combined with good policy, with the understanding of how do we create laws and policies that return the best citizen home. I think we will see this issue become less and less poignant.
In a couple of minutes, I'll throw it open for questions from the audience, but let me just raise one other California question, since this apparently will be a hot issue. In 1978, the Briggs Initiative, 3 members of the Briggs family got a referendum on the ballot. California voters decided to expand the number of crimes for which capital punishment could be used and make that much more likely. Now all 3 Briggs, still alive, are saying they've realized that was a mistake. And so there's apparently going to be another initiative on the ballot to get rid of capital punishment in California and make it life imprisonment without a possibility of parole. What do you think about that proposal?
Let me answer it first from the position of Prison Fellowship Ministries, and then my personal sense. We will abide by the law of the states. And God has ordained, I believe, a form of government that allows the people to speak from their conscience, their sense of what the Spirit is saying, and laws are formed in our states based on that process. We will support the laws of the state that we're working in. I think we've seen even over the last 5 to 10 years with different, the Justice Project and some other organizations, that again it's been affirmed that humans are not infallible. And when we give that life or that death sentence, my bottom line concern is that the right decision at the end of the day? And if we give that death sentence, what always concerns me is, are we positive? And I think we've seen with the emergence of DNA, the ability to go back to some of these cases, look at them again, we're seeing death row inmates come off of death row. Personally, I believe we should look at it again. Where do I land on it? I'm still processing that. I think it's a question that we should wrestle with. And then every state, through its voters, through its processes, should pass those laws. I will tell you that I've been on death row recently in Angola in the state of Louisiana, and I met an inmate who's literally suing for the right for the state to carry out his sentence. He's come to Jesus. He knows what he did is wrong. He knows the law of the state. And frankly, I was shocked with his submissive attitude. There was the last individual that they executed in Angola was a convicted pedophile, was a predatory pedophile. He too sued for the right, for the penalty to be carried out. And this is what he told Warden Kane. He said, "Warden Kane, I have prayed and prayed and prayed for Jesus to take this away from me, and he hasn't. I cannot be let out." His mother came to Warden Kane and said, "Warden Kane, I understand, My son has been different from a very young age. He cannot be let out. And so I weigh those, right? And I just pray, Lord, speak through the people, speak through the process you've put into place, and please make us wise. I think it is one of those issues that will maybe plague us as we continue as fallible human beings to lead in our land, make right policies, right laws. I think there'll be a tension, and I think we need to enter into the tension and enter into the debate and allow the Lord to work through the process of creating laws and policies.
Okay, what questions have any of you been processing?
Jim, thank you very much for coming. You spoke a little bit about some of the policies in the states that allow prison fellowship access to these inmates, and we've had some speakers here this week that have talked in some detail about barriers being erected, stigmas being attached to those who would bring a biblical-based approach or even traditional values approach to many of the issues. Can you speak a little bit more in depth about what you're facing out there? Is prison fellowship still welcomed with open arms in these prisons, or what's the writing on the wall that you're seeing?
In our situation in dealing in the world of incarceration and also with justice fellowship, and I think because of what prison fellowship and justice fellowship is doing, the Colson Center also is being shown favor. We have no barriers right now. We have governors calling us. But the issue at the end of the day is the bottom line of their budgets. When I can go in and say, you know, our least attractive statistics across the country show us that when Jesus is involved, recidivism is 10%. Recently, Minnesota studied a unit that we lead in Minnesota. The state of Minnesota came back and said recidivism is 2.4% in that unit. And that's tracking every inmate that's been through that unit personally for 15 years. But we use a 10% rate that we see in a pre-release program in Texas. 10% with Jesus, 50% without Jesus. And I've literally been able to sit with governors and say, Governor, I'll let you do the math. Again, at the average of $40,000 an inmate per year, how would you like this to look in your correction system? And I've had governors lean across the table and say, can you come work in our state and not let anybody know you're here? Yes. If that's how we would serve you, then that's the way we would serve. We recently, and Holy Saturday, I was on Rikers Island. 3 years ago, all religious programming in Rikers Island was stopped, and only their chaplains could do religious activity. Last year, we were called by the new warden of Rikers Island saying, how much can you do, how quickly? And I sat with a warden on Holy Saturday who is just a wonderful Jesus-following man who sees his wardenship as a calling. And again, it was how much, how often, how many studies, how many angel tree programs, how can we show these inmates Jesus? There were 150 inmates in that gym, and Rikers is really one of the roughest places I've ever been, because these are generally short-term, gang-related criminals. 83 men stood to come to Jesus in front of their peers in that gymnasium. And there is no barrier there for us. How long will that window be open? I don't know. That's why we are very, very urgent right now. We don't know how long this window is going to be open. We don't know how long we're going to be welcomed into these places. So we're trying to get through these doors as quickly as we can, because God right now, I believe, it's just God showing favor.
Just a follow-up question. What sense do you have of competition from Muslim groups and other religions trying to establish a presence in prisons?
Obviously, particularly Muslim groups feed on the anger in prisons. The other interesting aspect of that is we've been told by wardens and directors of corrections that Muslim imams will not come into the prisons unless they're paid. It's an honor issue. So as states cut their budgets, one of the things they're cutting is chaplaincies, and consequently there are fewer imams being paid to go into prisons. And but the wonderful aspect we have of Christianity is this continued aspect of volunteerism. And so we keep going in. And that's another place of favor that we have among wardens and directors of corrections in states, is that we don't cost them anything. And we come in and spend time with the inmates. Statistics show that if an inmate is just visited in prison, recidivism goes down. It doesn't have to be the same person. It doesn't have to be someone they know. And it only needs to be once a week. If they just get a visit from someone from their free world who's coming in and saying, you're not invisible, I see the image of God in you, the recidivism rate goes down. So when we have followers of Jesus doing that, we counteract anything that Islam can do. And again, you know, God is doing interesting things with the budget crunches. We still see the issue, though, particularly in New York and in Florida, where we have this recruiting and, if you would, evangelizing happening by militant Islam. But the wardens will separate that when they see it happening, because that creates a violence. But when they see Christians emerging, most wardens will put those Christians together, because their experience as a warden, believer or not, is that when Christians are together, there is this rock in the pond effect of good behavior. In one of our units in South Bay in Florida, where we have the Urban Ministry Institute happening, the warden told me that he uses that program and those inmates to reward his corrections officers. They love serving in that unit because the men respect them, the men do not have violent issues, the men resolve their own conflict, and so consequently, prison officers' unions love us. We get a very interesting support from the unions when we're involved in prisons. Again, one of those interesting combinations we see.
Ed?
Prison Fellowship been doing amazing things in prison ministry, but also under Chuck Colson, been doing so much with Christian worldview kind of issues, teaching, training, Breakpoint radio program that I used to write for, and advocacy of many different kinds. Was that Chuck doing those things, or do you see, is the organization, the Prison Fellowship, still looking to continue those kind of efforts? And I'm just curious what's going on there and what might be on the table.
You know, we, as was said, I've been there since July, and we've gone through a reorganization where we've brought the whole organization really tightly back together. We can track the emergence of Prison Fellowship Ministries with Chuck's spiritual growth. He comes out of prison and he makes that statement, I will not forget these men. Prison Fellowship is formed. Finds himself engaged in the prisons, and he understands there are real policy issues that have to be dealt with, and Justice Fellowship is formed, and the activity with legislatures and governors and leaders. And then, you know, following that, he begins asking the question, you know, why were there 235,000 people in prison when he came out of prison 35 years ago, and now there are 2.3 million? And that's when I think the Lord really caused him to understand the issue is a worldview issue. It's lack of moral training in the morally formative years. You know, why do we have this emerging prison population? It's the lack of moral training in the morally formative years. Are there other contributing factors? Poverty, the breakdown of the family? Yes. Yes. Frankly, some individuals have the deck stacked against them. But at some point, it comes down to the personal choice. And it becomes an issue of the grid through which I see my world and the options I give myself in those choices. And when we don't have the moral training in the morally formative years, we don't have a solid biblical Christian grid through which to see my world and make my decisions, oftentimes we make the wrong ones. The issues of the Manhattan Declaration, life, that every individual is created in the image of God, that every individual should be created with dignity, whether it be an unborn child or an incarcerated felon. The issue of family. 85% of the children born last year in LA, this is by reading the birth certificates in the inner city hospitals, 85% of those individuals were born into a single family home. Divorce in the city of LA is extremely low because no one's married. The issue of family is huge when we talk about the issue of incarceration. The issue of religious liberty. If we don't have our religious liberty, we lose the ability to affect the family, and we lose the ability to ensure the dignity of human life. Those three in the Manhattan Declaration, which has come out of the evolution of the Colson Center, go all the way back to the day Chuck walked out of prison. And when we look at our entire organization, our entire ministry, those three things flow all the way through. If we can stay firm in the Colson Center side, we can train up leaders, we can train up families, we can train up individuals in our culture, we can train up politicians, lawyers, business people, entrepreneurs to understand the values Jesus has given us. That will affect our crime rate. That will affect our incarceration rate. But it's really all three of them working together that's attacking this issue. That's Chuck's legacy. That's his story. That's what God did in and through him. And frankly, it's a joy for us to pick up the baton with all of you. I mean, it's not just us. It's all of us as the Church of Jesus Christ. He never set out to start an organization. He set out to grow a movement. The local church is God's plan A, and there's no plan B. And the job of Prison Fellowship, Justice Fellowship, and the Colson Center is to employ, empower, and release that local church as best we can into this issue. That was a whole sermon you didn't ask for. So that was the preacher suddenly came out of me there. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to begin by saying how encouraging it is to hear your vision for Prison Fellowship, especially at this time when we may be saying goodbye to Chuck. And it's very encouraging to hear that God has put this fire in your soul to continue this ministry. I'm curious as to what you see the church responding to this call. How do you see the churches coming together to really meet some of the needs you've been talking about?
You know, I'm encouraged, especially over the last 8 months, talking to pastors of large churches. We have some church leaders who are nationally seen as church leaders that I think we're going to see over the next few months publicly start talking about their churches getting very serious about not just ministry in the prisons, but ministry to the ex-offender. And what it means to truly specifically come alongside of them with their particular barrier issues. The lifeblood is the 150 to 300 member church across our country. I could go off on a number of stories. One in Oklahoma City, a church of about 250 people. Every year for the last several years, they've taken care of 250 Angel Tree children in the state of Oklahoma. And not only have they delivered gifts, but they've adopted a lot of these kids into their church. And I met a young lady and her sister who had been taken in by this church 10 years ago, and that young lady just graduated from nursing school. Both their mother and father were incarcerated, and their father continues to be incarcerated. But they were an Angel Tree family. And this church just came alongside of them and did what the church is designed to do. And there are those success stories. We have a man in the Bronx. Both of his parents were incarcerated through Angel Tree and the church. He went on to get his MBA, but now he's back in the Bronx pastoring. And to this date, he's planted 5 churches. 10% of the population in the Bronx is an ex-felon. And the recidivism rate of individuals in the Bronx is 87%. And this man, Michael Carrion, has been called back there to cause the local church to emerge, to break that cycle. And I'm encouraged as I see, people that are pastoring and leading. And again, I think it's a lot with the younger generation. Start doing a really good job at asking, hey, why aren't we doing this? A lot of those of us who've been in leadership maybe a little too long, we don't see the forest for the trees. It's those why questions that really call us back into reality and say, yeah, why aren't we? Why aren't we doing this?
Well, let me ask a why question about the very nature of our prison system, which, as I understand it, came out of a Quaker understanding of penitentiary. That is, if people were left alone for long periods of time, they would be penitent and so forth. Doesn't really seem to have worked. Is there a problem with prisons generally as a way to restore people?
I think the way the Quakers saw it was probably accurate, but understand that when they understood that issue of becoming penitent, not only were they in favor of isolating individuals, but they isolated them with a plan.
Okay.
There was biblical teaching that those individuals were being taught how to become penitent. right? There was soul reformation along with social reformation. What we don't have by and large in our prison systems today is the soul reformation. If you talk to Warden Kane, 5,400 inmates in Angola, 4,800 of them are lifers. You can only be sentenced to Angola now in the state of Louisiana if you're sentenced to 50 years or more. But he has hundreds of inmates every night who spend the night without being watched over by a prison official because of the transformation of the soul. They're followers of Jesus, and they have become penitent of their previous lifestyle. But they have the opportunity to have the reformation of the soul. That's why we need to be so urgent in continuing to get the gospel into the facilities. I think there is still a way to reform the reform system. But again, how do we best position individuals to repent and change? That needs to be the question, because that then leads us to having good neighbors come home. I think the basis of the Quaker system is still good. However, we have started and continue to incarcerate people we're mad at, not people who are a danger to society. We have to get that separated. Incarcerating an individual who traded illegally on Wall Street but paid all the money back to the victims, putting that individual in jail for 6 years is not reasonable. Why would we do that? Why not sentence that individual to 6 years of creating jobs in the Bronx? Why not cause him to have a sentence that would cause him to literally understand, you know what, when you stole that money, you stole it from these people. Not necessarily in the individuals you took the cash out of their hand, but when those individuals who had the cash couldn't create jobs, this individual suffered. You need to go here for 6 years and become an entrepreneur in the Bronx and create jobs. Wouldn't that cause that individual to think more, this is what I did wrong, this is how I repay, this is my repentance, and now this is my new way of living? I believe it would. I believe that policy change would cause us to get into the right direction. Simply sitting that person for 6 years away from his family, away from his 4 kids, this is a true situation, for 6 years because we're mad at him, does not get us to the end of bringing a good neighbor home.
Other questions?
Thank you for coming out. I know that you're not on the Prison Fellowship International side of things, but I know that you interact. Could you give us a little bit idea of some of the things that they're seeing around the world?
Yeah, great question. They're our sister organization. You know, their reality is very different than ours in most countries, you know, particularly in areas like Myanmar. In Myanmar, if you're sentenced to prison and you have children, your kids go with you. And so your children serve that time. And one of the areas in Myanmar they're very active in is literally rescuing these children from prison, having orphanages for them, and you know, having the kids visit their parents but not grow up in a prison where it's obviously incredibly dangerous. Situations like the recent fire in Honduras, in Tegucigalpa is the capital, in Camiagua. And there were roughly 300 inmates that lost their lives, and when they identified them all, 270 of them were awaiting a charge. They hadn't even been charged yet. And Prison Fellowship was very active there in caring for the families and being with them. Their bodies were taken to Tegucigalpa, which is a couple hours away, and they cared for them while they're there. But now, you know, we're actually coaching them through Justice Fellowship on how to push for legislative and policy changes in Honduras. Prison Fellowship International has been very successful in the last 2 years in getting gospel ministry in prisons in Muslim countries. Actually, we have a couple countries we can't list because it would be dangerous for the individuals who are doing ministry there. So again, you know, you look at Jesus' instruction in Matthew 26, and you know, all of those individuals are in crisis transition points, the naked, the sick, in jail, and they become places, if you would, in countries where the gospel is not welcomed. They become the soft underbelly. We'll go ahead and preach the gospel to that group. They don't mean anything. But if we look back at the early church, it was those groups of people that didn't mean anything that actually rose up and brought the change to Asia Minor in 313 years. And Prison Fellowship is very active in that ministry around the world, 122 countries now.
So one last question. This seems to be an opportunity in America now for Christians and fiscal conservatives to be working together just because of the financial burdens the prisons place. Are you able to build alliances with non-Christians on that type of?
Very much so, and I consider it, again, one of the miracles. Justice Fellowship, President Pat Nolan, who was a legislator in California, spent time in jail for inappropriate use of funds, and then Chuck brought him to Justice Fellowship. Pat just has a gift at bringing together people from across the aisle. And it is a very unique situation because those on the liberal side of the aisle believe there should be more opportunities and shorter sentences. The right side of the aisle believes in fiscal responsibility. We accomplish both by having proper policy and laws in the issue of crime and incarceration and reentry. I'll use again a recent situation in California. The Urban Ministry Institute, a biblically based, rigorous study of theology, was fully supported from the left to the right. The left supported it because it is a rigorous educational program that leads to employment. That's the process these men are in. They will be employed when they leave. The left supported it. The right supported it because it will reduce recidivism. So we do find ourselves being able to build coalitions. We're praying that we can maintain those coalitions now for further legislative and policy change that may even affect access in public schools, may even affect our ability to see the gospel spread in other areas of culture. And you can pray with us on that. I think if we can get some of these groups working together and building these coalitions, we may be able to work with other organizations who have other focuses to build in that direction. We even, I can't name a couple organizations, but if I could, you would be very shocked these particular organizations supported us in California, verbally to the governor's office, and promoted us. Not only said we won't oppose this, but said this is a good thing for our prisons. And listeners and readers would go, you've got to be kidding me. But we want to protect their ability to continue to do what they do and to continue to partner with us.
Well, I'll ask you about that off camera in just a moment. But right now, this is the 21st and last of our Newsmaker interviews for this academic year. So I want to thank all the people who've been watching. And please join me now in thanking Jim for coming here and leading this wonderful organization.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and on behalf of Patrick Henry College, let me thank you very much for joining us today, and also thank Dr. Olasky for the superb set of interviews. Thank you for all those who joined us in person, those joining us on our live webcast, and of course there are some 400,000 readers of World Magazine who are going to be joining us in the print versions of today's interview and others that we've enjoyed. So please give your thanks again to Jim Liske and to Dr. Marvin Olasky.